morning sun slowly peeked over the mountain ridges that surrounded the mouth of Bradford Holler as its golden rays trickled through the forest canopy. Inside the primitive one-room cabin, Clarence Porter worked quickly but quietly to revive the remains of last night's fire in an effort to expel the morning chill in the air. Behind him, his wife Bridget and their infant son laid sound asleep as he carefully placed a large cast-iron pot on a hook above the fire, which would soon fill the room with the aroma of fresh biscuits. Despite the apparent routine of the morning, Clarence's mind was busy with worry. He looked out the window, intensely examining the shapes of the clouds, and he took note of the westerly wind that blew through the maple and chestnut trees. A canvas of yellow and red leaves floated to the forest floor just as gently as feathers fallen. His eyes slowly drifted beyond the surrounding forest to the slow-moving waters of the mighty Ohio River that glistened in the distance. The water was calm for the first time in recent memory. This was a good sign. Indeed, the next few days were sure to be the perfect weather for the big move. It had been a hard year for the folks who called Scioto County home, especially Clarence, since a big tide came through, destroyed his mill. He had tried his hand at working at the lumber camps up in the hills, and even as a loading hand down on the boat docks in Portsmouth. But these jobs were only seasonal and barely paid enough to buy meal and flour for the young family to survive. Yet, Clarence took note of the steam engine and flat-bottom boats that brought a steady stream of foreigners from distant lands who traded flour, bacon, and whiskey before continuing on their long journeys. They told tales of cities that lay in western Kentucky. Heck, a man could find his fortune out there was a common refrain. Indeed, they said that this great river represented hope and promise and eventually emptied into the mythical mighty waters of what the natives called the Mississippi and flowed to what the old-timers said was the ends of the earth in New Orleans. Clarence took another look at his sleeping wife. They had only been married for less than 2 years. Oh, she was a beautiful gal, and she had trusted him too, that he would provide a secure future for her, and she was finally well enough again. But the baby, well, he was undersized, especially for the offspring of a strong Irish woman and a rugged Englishman. Clarence suddenly felt a call to action from deep inside of him. This was no place to raise his small new family. They deserved better than this. He returned his glance out the window to the river in the distance. There comes a time in a man's life where he's got to make a decision to forever change his family's destiny. And for Clarence, today was the day. Just like that, Clarence Porter took his wife and his son, and what few possessions they owned, and all the money they had in the world, $75, and bought a flat-bottom boat. All three of them set out on the waters of the Ohio, sailing towards the west, where the sun faded each evening, in search of a new life. The river was shallow, no more than a couple feet deep in most places, and full of rocks and snags. The young family usually couldn't travel any more than 10 miles a day, so their journey dragged on for nearly 2 months. Slowly, the riverbanks shifted from the wild forest to cultivated fields with signs of civilization when they finally arrived at a series of rapids near Louisville, Kentucky, where their voyage ran aground. It turns out the rumors that Clarence had heard from the foreigners was true. Louisville was booming due to the riverboat economy. He quickly landed the job at one of the mills in town and used the lumber from his boat to build a new cabin for his family. And so it was, the Potter family began a new life. And as the years went by, Clarence was finally able to provide all the necessary provisions to make life a little easier. And Bridget was a perfect wife. She made their cabin a home full of care and love. Yet, even in this prosperity, the couple grew more and more concerned for their son Jim. He had several bouts with sickness and fever as a baby, and now, even as a young boy, he was still undersized and sickly. For his part, Jim could only do light chores around the homestead. He wasn't strong enough to carry water or firewood. Secretly, his mother spent many nights fretting on what the future would hold for her only child. It doesn't seem like he eats as much as the other growing boys, she thought to herself. Will the other kids make fun of him? Will he be able to help his pa when he's older? And frankly, will he be man enough to carry on the family name? She had many questions and doubts. After all, what mother doesn't want her son to grow up big and strong? For his part, Clarence had serious doubts as to his son's physical strength. I don't believe he's ever going to be able to do the work of a normal man, he admitted to himself. But what tore the father's heart the most is when he heard the other kids refer to his only son as Little Jim. Even with those concerns, both parents continued to love and to raise their son the best they knew how to do. Now, there was a thriving horse industry in the area, and racing stables and breeding farms all over Louisville. Clarence figured, as small as his son was, he'd make a good jockey. So, by the time little Jim was 14, he began jockeying horses. And he also took a job as a cooper, hoping to build wooden barrels for the bustling shipping industry. But it seemed he'd never be like his dad, who tossed 50-pound bags of corn into wagons all day long at the mill. Nor would he ever be strong enough to swing a 10-pound hammer effortlessly at the blacksmith shop. Even his parents had resigned themselves to the reality that their son, little Jim, who was now 17 years old, would never be any taller than he was, all 5 foot 1 inches of him, and weighing a mere 105 pounds. Now, the folks in Kentucky had heard it said that the Lord works in mysterious ways, and that you could never judge a book by its cover. But I tell you, none of them could have ever predicted what would happen next in this story. On the morning of April 14th, 1828, when he was 17 years old, little Jim woke up in the morning to put his pants on just like he had every other day. But for some strange reason, he could barely button them. They had shrunk overnight, it seemed. At breakfast, Bridget could hardly believe her eyes as she watched as her son mopped an entire plate clean, and even asked for seconds. Same thing as supper that night. The very next morning, little Jim couldn't button his shirt collar anymore. Heck, by the end of that week, he couldn't fit his foot in his boots. Clarence took out the measuring string, and he had little Jim stand up against the wall where they had always measured his height. And lo and behold, the boy had grown a solid inch in 1 week. That's right. And over the next couple months, the boy continued to eat everything in the house, and garden for that matter. And he had clean outgrown every stitch of clothing that he owned. And strangest of all, he had gained nearly 30 pounds and was now taller than his mama. Clarence loaded up little Jim and took him into Louisville to buy him a new set of clothes. And you could have knocked most folks over with a feather when they saw little Jim. Roy Cagle closed down his general store, along with several other businessmen, and they followed Clarence and his son to the local tailor, John Watkins, where he had the boy stand in front of a measuring wall in the front of his store, surrounded by a score of curious onlookers. 5 foot 7 inches tall, the tailor yelled out, bumfuzzled and dumbfounded. Wagging tongues began to spread the word all over town that little Jim had grown 6 inches in just over 2 months' time. Well, what they been feeding that boy? Wondered Reverend Frank Harmon. I don't know, but it sure is peculiar, George Johnson said as he scratched his beard. Oh, he's just finally hit his growth spurt. It'll peter out by next month, Grandma Jenkins contended. Well, all right, that settles it. I'll bring him back the first Saturday of July, and we'll measure him again, Clarence declared as he and his son loaded up on the wagon and set out for home. The next month, the phenomenon continued, with little Jim growing at a staggering rate, both in weight and height. Even his little tiny voice began to take on a burly throatiness. By the time they returned to Taylor Watkins' store, little Jim was as tall as Clarence was. Nearly 100 people gathered and began to place wagers with one another on how much the boy had grown in the past month. Little Jim was standing in his socks when Mr. Watkins drew his measuring string from his heels to the top of his head. 5 foot 11 inches. The boy grew 4 inches in 1 month. A roar went through the crowd of onlookers. Many of the men looked dumbfounded as they were forced to pay up on bets they had made with other men. So began a weekly tradition in Louisville that would continue for the next 8 years. Every Saturday, Clarence would bring his son to town to buy bigger clothes and to have him officially weighed and measured in front of hundreds of locals and the curious tourists who were in town visiting from the steamships. By the time the young man was 21 years old, he was a staggering 6 foot 9 inches tall. And trust me, nobody called him Little Jim anymore. The unbelievable growth spurt continued until he was 25 years old, until he was a towering 7 foot 9 inches tall and over 300 pounds. He was suddenly the tallest man in America and the second tallest human in the world. Big Jim Porter, as everyone locally called him, was now known as the Kentucky Giant all across America. He was so tall, he couldn't do a normal-sized man's work, so he tried his hand as a stagecoach driver, where the comical spectacle would cause folks to glower at him when he passed by. Big Jim's head towered in the air like a church steeple, and his size 15-inch boots dangled a couple inches from the ground. He was so big, it looked like 2 men were stacked on top of each other. He never even had to leave the driver's seat. He could simply lean to one side or the other and open the coach doors for the passengers with his long arms. It was said that children could sit in the palm of his hand that measured 13 inches from his wrist to the tip of his middle finger. He walked with a 4.5-foot cane that was as big as a bedpost. He even had a special hunting gun made for him that was 8 feet long and a sword that was 5 feet long. Suddenly, Big Jim Porter was one of the most famous men in America. In 1836, Big Jim briefly traveled all across America as the tallest man alive. Yet, after a while, he got tired of all the attention, and as he put it, no matter where he went, no ceiling was high enough, no chair was big enough, and no bed was long enough. So he returned to Kentucky and even turned down a lucrative contract from the world-famous P.T. Barnum's Circus. Instead, in 1947, Big Jim took his money that he had earned from his fame, and he built the most glamorous hotel and tavern in the southern United States, and he named it the Big Gun. All the door frames were 10 feet high, and all the furniture was fit for a giant. Wealthy farmers came from as far as New Orleans, and traders from Pittsburgh and Cincinnati would stay at Jim's hotel for weeks at a time. Even the famous author, Charles Dickens, wrote about the time he met Big Jim in his famous book, Pictures from Italy and American Notes, where the author said, "When I saw him walking in a crowd of 6 feet tall men, Big Jim Porter was like a lighthouse walking amongst lampposts." The irony of this story is that it seems that Jim's parents, Clarence and Bridget, were right. He would never be a normal man after all. Big Jim Porter died in his sleep in 1859 at 47 years old. Even in death, folks marveled at him, as they had to build a special casket for him that measured 9 feet and 1 inch in length. Today, the Kentucky Giant rests at Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, where his tombstone is located just a few feet away from Colonel Harlan Sanders and the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Muhammad Ali. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story about Big Jim Porter. Let me know what you think about this story in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more true stories on Appalachia's past.